Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming today. My name is Quinlan. Are you familiar with the map of Ireland? Many of you here are familiar with the map of Ireland. So I was born right on the border in the Republic of Ireland, in a little town, not a little town, it's a big town now, called Monaghan. And my dad worked in the Department of Customs and Excise, so he was obviously involved with the inflow and outflow of excise and customs. And that's going back a long time, pre-Second World War and after the Second World War. So what I'd like to do is just start on with some of these images and then follow along a little bit regarding what I love about my native land and just sharing a little bit of the history. First of all, anybody been to Ireland here? Ooh, a lot of people have been to Ireland, okay. Well, welcome. You're very welcome indeed. All right, so if I'm doing this right, Skip, we should be moving on to another slide. So very quickly, this is just a little bit about my own life. There's my parents, and I'm the youngest of 5 children. I was educated in Ireland, did a lot of work at the Royal Irish Academy of Music, if you're familiar with that, studied piano and cello. And then I founded Spiral Journeys in 1988, and the reason I did that, I raised my children in Boston. People kept coming to me and say, we're going to Ireland. I would get out the maps and the books and suddenly realize that I was designing these journeys, and then a number of years later decided that it was a good idea for me to do this. This is the entrance to Newgrange, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, one of the very famous sites, megalithic sites in Ireland. Oh, by the way, sorry, that's me at about age 9 at a little school called St. Joseph's in Drogheda, which was run by the Little Sisters of No Mercy. And then this is just part of what I try to do is when I bring groups is to design that slow journey. I'm kind of weaving in and out here a little bit. Is that okay? Can everybody hear me? And so part of that is going to places what I call hidden Ireland, and there's a lot of properties. I did bring some material on those. But again, there's so much to do and see, and generally I do a 10-day tour or a 12-day tour and try to see as much of the west and the southwest, and then possibly go to the east or to the Midlands and go to some of the megalithic sites, such as Newgrange, which probably is the most famous. It actually predates Stonehenge. So I think that the smaller groups help to build community. As you know, here you're in a relatively small college. And I think that's lovely because you're getting to know everybody here and to get to know one another, which is so important. So, Ireland was an agrarian culture. It still is to a great degree, but clearly, like every place else in the world, that has changed. However, very much like Maine, there's been a resurgence now of going back to farming and to organic farming, which has become very popular over there. And I just put in some of these images here to show you. Now that's very typical on the upper right-hand corner of the stone walls. You know, in the ranches in the United States of America, if you're raising bison or steer or cattle, you know, you move your herd or a part of your herd every maybe part of as the seasons change, you would be moving the herd to a different part of grasslands for them to graze. In Ireland, what you have to do is open up one of those walls and let your sheep or your cattle go into the next area, presumably that it's your land, and then close up the wall and go on from there. So it's a little bit more laborious, but I'm sure that that's why these beautiful stone walls have sustained and remained over centuries. That rainbow, I actually took that picture and I almost got the rainbow on top of the sheep's back, so. There are no stockyards in Ireland. Did anybody know that here? All meat and all any kind of domestic animals, they're all raised, they're free range. So they're out in the fields, and as you travel, you will see herds of sheep, or, you know, even up on the cliffs, you'll see the sheep and the cattle. And I think that's really says a lot for the country, the fact that they've been able to sustain that culture in terms of providing good, really healthy organic meat to families. These two ladies over on the left, I grew up, my mother raised hens during the war. Well, everybody did. And now they're back in vogue too. But these two little hens remind me of my childhood. So traditional farming, as I said earlier, is starting to fade out. There's a lot being done with hydroponics, so you're familiar with that. You have a beautiful place here, and I've been learning a little bit more about that on my walk with Becky today in terms of growing your own food. And clearly, you'll see here that permaculture is very big in Ireland because it's a small country. You know, it's an island, for one thing, and we've been invaded by everybody except the Romans. So all different kinds of agriculture have landed there over centuries. And, but there's a tremendous love of the land in Ireland, and I think this is one of the things, when you've been invaded so many times, it's important to recognize that what you have is so valuable. And that's why there is a passion for sustaining the land and for, it's not so much about ownership. There are several different ways one can have land in Ireland. There's leasehold, there's freehold. A lot of those things also are true of Mexico. So when countries have been occupied by another culture or nation, very often when liberty comes and the land goes back to the people, there is this tendency to assimilate different laws into the culture, to preserve the land and make sure that it can't be occupied again. As you know, the 6 counties are still part of the UK, although rumor has it that with Brexit, that the 6 counties is having deep conversations with the Dáil in Dublin, which would be a wonderful thing and possibly lead to a united Ireland. And the little house on the right there is showing you solar. And people say solar in Ireland. Is there any sun in Ireland? Well, you don't need sun to have solar because you will gather it when the sun is out, obviously, but it's a storage system. And you'll see these dotted all over the land. And you'll also see now in modern Ireland a lot of wind power. And if you're in the west of Ireland and it's windy, anybody who's been there, you know how windy it gets. I put that image of that's a very old painting from the National Gallery in Dublin showing the seaweed gatherers down on the lower left here. Sorry. And I keep forgetting I have this little laser. You see that? Okay. There's the solar. And this is, again, some of that agriculture and hydroponic, and again, organic farming. This would be possibly, I'm not sure what they're doing here, but it's clearly irrigation, a different system of irrigation. This image over here is one of the old images of Moore Street in Dublin, which was similar to, say, Quincy Market in Boston, where you had open vending that's a very strong memory from my childhood, was going with my parents down Moore Street and listening to the banter and the chatter from the fishmongers and the people with vegetables and eggs and hens and live poultry. Strawberries, right. And then you'd get in trouble if you sneaked one, right? Okay, so obviously Ireland there's a lot of lakes and inland waterways in Ireland. I mean, it is surrounded by the Irish Sea, by the Celtic Sea, and by the Atlantic Ocean. And of course the North Channel, which talk a little bit later on Belfast, or if people have any questions about why the north of Ireland remained, but of course it was the gateway to the North Sea and the shipbuilding. So this is a recent sculpture here. Now the rivers in Ireland are given names, and this is Anna Livia. Anna Livia is the Liffey, and Dublin, of course, is built on the River Liffey. And when the Vikings came in and began finding their way up through this estuary from the ocean, it's a tidal river. And of course, that's where they began building their homes and their towns. And even today, when they're digging to build a new structure, very often they'll hit something Viking. And then everything stops, you know. And there's a big yellow band around it, and a lot of excitement. And, but very often cordoned off for a long period of time, and sometimes not even restored to the builder because it becomes part of the archaeological history of the country. So again, with the Royal Canal, the Ulster Canal, and these have all been centers of commerce and still are. But they're also beautiful interior rivers and waterways that are very popular for, obviously, for barging and for boating and just for family holidays. I mean, the Shannon is the largest and longest river in Ireland, but there are many other beautiful rivers on the interior. I'm big on wildlife, and I'm a little upset with Tourism Ireland because they don't, for some reason, they used to publish beautiful literature on the wildlife of Ireland, and everything now is the wild Atlantic. You know, everything's being published for the wild Atlantic, and I keep saying, but I need some wildlife imagery. So I've kept some of the older ones, but these are just some of the creatures that are definitely native. Whoops, sorry. Here we are. So this little guy up here is, that's a pine marten. I'm not sure what his equivalent would be in Maine, but somewhere in the weasel family, probably polecat. Now this obviously is a Connemara pony. Anybody heard about the Connemara pony? Oh, yes, some people have. Well, this is a very, these ponies are, they don't get much taller than about 14 hands. But they're very rugged horses, and they're wonderful saddle horses. They're great with children, and they're very popular here in North America. People do import them as riding, not necessarily work horses, but for riding. And when you travel along through County Clare up into Connemara and you see the stony fields, you'll very often see a small herd or a clan of these beautiful ponies. And again, a lot of them have free range, but they're rounded up and brought back to the stables if there's a storm. This little guy is called, he's a little shrew with a very long nose. And this is a, sorry. Oops. Not used to this little gizmo here. Okay. So that is a European robin or an Irish robin. And I took that picture. This little guy was very, very friendly, very almost in my hand every day when I was staying over in, at Ashley Park in Tipperary. Very sweet. And these are, anybody know what those are? Any guesses? Well, at one time, of course, Ireland had wild boar. You're going back to the Bronze Age and the early settlers. But these are actually feral pigs who have become the most recent wild boar in Ireland. This is the corncrake, which is very much a bird of my childhood because I would fall asleep hearing this little bird, and it almost became extinct, but it's coming back. And again, this is the puffin, and this bird here actually breeds out on the Skellig Islands. And again, just some heron, white heron, and of course the great kingfisher. Now, megalithic. Okay. Anybody studying megalithic sites here, or done any reading on it, or interested in it? Not yet, huh? Not yet. Okay, so these dolmens, I mean, there's a lot of different kind of legend around. This is a very famous one. This is the Drombeg Circle, which is out in West Cork. Beautiful place. And what you'll notice here, I mean, you're in a Catholic college here, and what you'll find very often with these, see, when Christianity came to Ireland, part of the Celtic cross, are you familiar with the Celtic cross, which has the cross and then it has the circle around it? This is what they did. They encompassed the cross with a circle like the circle of stones. And that was the origin, or one of the origins, of the Celtic cross. But very often you'll see, especially older ladies, saying their rosary in here, just walking in that circle. And again, these are some of the mounds at Knowth and in County Meath. There's been a lot of recent archaeology and opening up of these, and here's some of them right here. They've actually found the largest number of not artifacts, but artwork inside these of any in Europe. So they're still kind of uncovering a lot of that, but it's great because it's a lot of work for young archaeologists. You have to be part of that professional team in order to work here, but you can tour these places. And this is out in the Barra Peninsula way out in West Cork. Pretty wild and woolly that day, as I remember. And again, Ireland has the largest number of standing stones above and below ground in Ireland. But you can see the landscape is very similar, especially when you go inland. Okay, anybody know about the Ogam Stones? This is how people would count, or count mileage. So these go back to the 5th or 6th century. And Michael would be interested, well, he knows about this, I'm sure. So in other words, if you, there are 20 symbols, and they reflect 80 Gaelic sounds. So Gaelic is a little bit of a generic term, because if you talk about the Gauls or Normandy, or you go up around that region of France, I mean, they're the Gaelic languages, but we're now talking probably around 5th and 6th century would have been very old Irish, similar to what the Brehon laws would have used, or maybe even a little bit after the Brehon laws. So the 5 vowels were added later, and possibly from the Latin and Christian influence, since the Irish Gaelic has 10 vowels. Michael knows that. So here they are. So here's Northern Ireland. So I mentioned to you that I was born in Monaghan, which is just about here. And then we moved a little bit like in around here. But these Ogam Stones are all over look at how many there are down in this area. So clearly when people came in by whatever craft, rowing or sailing or however they got there, they were establishing systems of communication for the people who came after them. And the systems of communication would have been a lot of these types of stones. And as you can see, this gentleman is standing here, and if you were coming along with your family and you weren't quite sure of where the next meal might be or the next place to camp, this would be an indicator of possibly where you could head off to. And here's one over here which has fallen over. I imagine it's fallen over. I certainly wouldn't try to move it. Now, Newgrange. Okay. So there's a wonderful story about Newgrange in that we're not quite sure who showed up in this region first, but what we do know is, you see these swans right here? These are well, they're not mute swans, but they're swans that would come all the way from Iceland and fly and land on this area, which is the Boyne River, Bruna Boyne. Grange just means land, so it's Newgrange would be new land, and that's an anglicized version of Bruna Boyne. But as you can see here, here's Cygnus right here. And Cygnus would have been, early travelers would have navigated by the stars. They would have used celestial navigation. And somehow they followed this, and they ended up, and when they got there, guess what they found on the river? They found these swans. So these are very much connected to prehistory. And for generations, these swans come back every year, and they breed and raise their babies here. Now, this is the famous Author Stone. So you can see some of the artwork here, which is the triple spiral. And then this is a sort of draft of the interior of the chamber. But what's interesting is, inside this chamber up here, which is we would call the capstone, it's estimated now in Anthony Murphy's latest book on Newgrange, called, the book is right there, I'm not remembering the title right now, but he's a recent scholar who has studied this whole region, and he's estimating that Newgrange is 7,000 years, not 5. Now what's interesting is this here, when they uncovered this, what they discovered was that this passage leading up to the top of the mound as a lookout has never leaked, and it's designed in the shape of the neck of a swan, which of course I love that part of the story because it tells you how significant this journey must have been for these people over, I mean, certainly it took more than a couple of years, I'm sure. And then obviously it's famous as, it's one of the oldest solar observatories in the world that we know of. So when you enter the chamber, which you can do, However, for the winter solstice, there's a lottery now. You have to get your name in, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people who submit their names to the lottery. And that's in order to be here for the sunrise on the 21st of December, which is the winter solstice. So when you enter the chamber, the light comes across and it lasts for 17 minutes. So they only allow 17 people into the chamber. I love numbers. I love this whole connection of the, I'm not a mathematician by any means, but I really love the numerology around all of this. And so, you can, if you get into the chamber, which you can as a tourist any time of the year, I mean, you have to get a ticket, and I get my groups in by buying the tickets ahead of time. And then when you go into the chamber, you have to, people were very small back then, so you have to duck down very small and climb. And I've had people who could not do it because they're too tall to actually bend all the way. And then you walk all the way to the back of the chamber here. And now, of course, what they've done, which whatever your feelings are about it, it certainly gives all of us an opportunity to see the interior of the chamber, but it's artificially lighted, just as it would look when the sun came through on that sunrise on the winter solstice. And this would mean that, for the early people, would mean that there was this fear that the sun was leaving the earth. But once they could trap the light in here, they knew that it wasn't gone forever. And so they would begin looking at opportunities to start planting again. Now, ley lines. This is another thing that fascinates me, because I think the ley lines, again, associated with celestial navigation, are particularly interesting from Newgrange. And I'm going to show you that from Newgrange, right here. So here's Newgrange, and it goes all the way to, it travels actually to London, goes to Paris, goes all the way to Rome, and eventually ends up where? At the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now that's no accident, and you can see how the mathematical formation is all associated with the celestial navigation, and this is how these ley lines were originally set up. And very often in Wales and Ireland and any place really in Europe, these ley lines were set out with rows of stones. You'll find a lot of rows of stones that appear to be going nowhere, but they have a definite purpose. And of course, obviously, all the way from Newgrange all the way to the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And most castles and cathedrals and churches would have been built over these waterways or through the ley lines. So that form of celestial navigation has followed through to modern times, even today. And I can't really speak to all of it, but I know that there are certain aspects of building a cathedral, the type of stone that's used, the type of altar stone that's used, all goes back to these origins. Not just in ancient Ireland, but certainly going back. So you see here, Newgrange and Giza Pyramid, 36 degrees apart. So, okay, so this is, again, if you look at Ireland, of course, being at one time what would have been considered certainly a pagan country or a country without Christianity until Rome, until the Christians arrived. So the goddess, Bridget, she would have been originally Breathe, which is the goddess of spring. And as in most cultures where the cultures became Christianized, then they used the information and the language of the people in order to convert them to Christianity, or to at least influence their thinking. And so obviously Breathe, goddess of spring, became Bridget. And she's famous for this Bridgets Cross. You're familiar with that cross, anybody? Yeah. And of course, what's interesting about this cross is that it also is the four directions. And there's quite an interesting story about how she came about weaving this when she was sitting at the deathbed of her father. And then, as you'll see, many of these, the early sacred wells would have been the well of the goddess breed. And then in Christian times, a lot of them are now covered or they've been blessed into Christianity. And then, of course, here's himself here kicking the snakes out. Well, there's no snakes in Ireland. There's lizards and newts and all kinds of things. But actually, geologically, they just, for some reason, they never showed up there. But what's interesting about this story is that the goddess, one of the symbols of the goddess or the Druids would have been the snake. Would have been, today people are doing a lot of tattooing. Well, it would have been a form of tattoo. And that would have been the symbol of the goddess, or in Druid culture would have been the symbol of the Druids. So essentially what Patrick was doing was getting rid of the Druid culture and going back to using, so this is how this little story began. And if you go back to thinking about the triple spiral at Newgrange, also the story of the shamrock. You know, it's really a triple spiral. And then, of course, the story evolved into the shamrock being the three persons in one God, because it was this little plant that grows everywhere in Ireland. And so these would have been places of healing in ancient times and would continue to be places of healing or blessing. So has anybody heard that expression before? And so it is attributed actually to W.B. Yeats. And I've used a different form of it here. But he actually said, "You'll meet no strangers here, only friends you haven't met." And it's a beautiful, so I compare a little bit of Irish life. Here's a cottage, and you can see the big hearth and how people would have lived and brought in the turf fire. This was actually, I was celebrating a birthday in Dublin a few years back. And I think about the nomadic life of the Bedouin, very similar to the early nomadic life of the Celts. Because again, if you were traveling, go back to those Ogam Stones, you'd be looking for the next place for a warm meal or for some comfort. And then people always ask me about the Black Irish, because here are the Vikings right here. That's the Viking coloring. That's the green eyes and the red hair, which is, and you'll see a lot of this in Ireland. But people ask me about the Black Irish, and that's essentially the influence of the Moors and people from the Mediterranean, because Ireland being an island, everybody traded back and forth. If you had a piece of wood and you could sit on it and row, you brought whatever your goods were and you traded. And so that's essentially where a lot of the darker hair, the black hair, and the darker eyes would have come from, that period in history, and still to this day. So here's the legend of the Selkie. Does anybody know that story? There's a wonderful film called The Secret of Rowan Inish. I don't know why, but I've looked at it a number of times. I've now shared it with my grandchildren, and the little girl in it always reminds me of myself. I think I would have been right out there. Oops, sorry. Getting carried away here into my Irishness. Okay. So, but the Selkie is the story of, and this I think is probably a universal story in a lot of Celtic legends or folklore. So the man is watching her from the shore, and eventually she comes on shore and she sheds her skin and she hides it because she believes that at some day she will have to go back to sea. And of course the story is that he saw where she hid the skin. And the story goes from there. But The Secret of Rowan Inish is a beautiful film, maybe something that you could have in your library here. Yeah, there's an Irish teapot and a little tea cozy. But the Bedouins, see, again, when you travel in that part of the world, you cannot leave without a full tummy or have lots to drink. And there's no refusing it. So I think that's part of the Irish hospitality as well. Now, the Brehon laws, and somebody was asking me about this earlier. So when I was growing up, if my parents were having a fight, I remember my mother saying to my father, "I wish they'd bring back those Brehon laws," because they were laws of equality and clearly written down in a very early form of Irish language, even pre-Book of Kells. So you're going back to the earliest form of the language. So much so that when the parchments, some of the parchments have been found, it's a special form of translation. And I did bring a book there done by Catherine Duggan. She's an attorney in California. And Catherine she grew up, spent the early years of her life in Ireland with her parents, and then went on to law school, and then was fascinated with the Brehon laws, and came back and studied them at, I believe she studied at Trinity College, and I think a lot of the early translations are available at Trinity College. So gender equality rights to the land and property, and these rights are still on the books. The Brehon laws are still on the books. So in order to become a Brehon, which means judge, you would be chosen from the community. And so the people would have been educated in some way, or they would have had some form of language. After all, if we had Ogam Stones early on, somebody was figuring out numbers and words and language. So when the Elizabethans came, they obviously tried to supersede the Brehon laws because they wanted British law, the law of the king of the land. But they did attempt to supersede them, but like really smart people, the British were, they tried to integrate some of those laws, and consequently, those laws are still on the books and required to be studied by Irish law students, and I believe they're studied here also. Catherine has come around and done presentations at Boston College and other colleges around the East Coast. Maybe you can get her to come here sometime. How are we doing for time, Michael? Okay? Okay, so again, and this of course is a very painful period in Irish history, but I think there's also a lot that has not been shared or recorded. I think the best book that I ever read on this was written by an English woman. I'll go on to her in just a second. So it was a terrible period in time, but there were also people who did very generous things too. People who did help women and children who were clearly starving. Has anybody ever heard the term souper, S-O-U-P-E-R? People have heard that term. Well, part of what happened, if you were a family, basically who were thrown out for not paying your rent as a tenant farmer, and you were walking the roads and there was no source of food, people say, well, the woods were filled with, with wildlife and with deer, and you had the oceans. If you did that, you would have been shot or hanged or worse. So then what happened was all of the poaching, you really risked your life, is what I'm saying. So this is obviously the remains of one of the famine houses. And a lot of these places, they just dot the land. Nobody really cares to live in them or does anything with them, except the sheep. They find shelter in the wintertime. This is The Great Hunger, and if you have not read, this is probably the best book because it really gives you a political insight into what was going on between England and Ireland at that time. And it certainly has, I think it covers a lot of the story that has not always been recorded accurately in history. And again, it's just one person's perspective, but as a student of the history, she did do this book, and she died in 1949. So Cecil Woodham Smith. So it's still available. It's still in print. Who survived the famine in Ireland? What did you have to do or be in order not to starve to death? Well, if you worked for the gentry, if you had a skill, or you had some way of providing a service that was invaluable, that nobody else could provide. Now, on my mother's side, they're Powers, P-O-W-E-R. It's Power over there. Here it's sometimes Powers. But they were artisans. I mean, on my maternal grandfather's side, the Russells, they were stained glass makers. I mean, they didn't make this, but I'm just using that as to illustrate. And again, the Power-Russell family, then the Powers were coach builders. Well, if you look back in the period in coach building, you can imagine what the gentry needed. They had beautiful coaches to get around, ponies and traps for the children. So that family, the Power family, had a craft that was invaluable. And the part of that that did spill over into my mother's life was that my maternal grandfather, John Power, was apprentice. He apprenticed to his grandfather on doing drafting and making blueprints for coaches. And then eventually was hired by the Great Northern Railroad as a blueprint maker and draftsman when the railroads came in. Do you know about this, the Choctaw Nation relationship to the famine in Ireland? Does anybody know about this? Some people are nodding. This is a young sculpture in County Cork, and this sculpture just went up, I think it's 2 years ago, 2014. Beautiful park outside Cork, and it's called Kindred Spirit. But the story behind it is that in 1831, of course, you know about the Great March of the people, the Choctaws, who walked, and many of them died, the Trail of Tears. And there was some relationship or some kindred sense that they felt when they heard about the famine in Ireland. And so in 1847, they collected $170 US dollars, which the equivalent of that today would be tens of thousands. And in 1990, the leaders participated in the annual famine walk in County Mayo, which was one of the counties that was really, really severely hit by the famine. And and then the Irish went over and participated in the 500-mile walk with them. So there's this relationship that has been growing over a period of time. And then this beautiful monument, which is 9 feathers, stainless steel feathers, representing the Choctaw Nation. And obviously there's been a lot of, again, ongoing communication between the Choctaw people and, whoops, sorry, done it again. And there's a nice little exchange of some blankets and nice little, the Great Seal of the Choctaw Nation, meeting with some of the Irish people. I don't know if I have enough time to do this, Michael, to get into the relationship between Gandhi and the Irish government. Yeah, well, you know about Gandhi. I'm sure everybody knows about Gandhi. So India was suffering a similar famine, but it was much later in the 1940s. But he began corresponding with Michael Davitt in Ireland, and there was a lot of correspondence going on between Gandhi and Michael Davitt, and this I think it had a lot to do with understanding the culture of famine and what happened, and how could Gandhi help his own people. And of course, this is before, obviously, and then he came back again in the early 40s, I guess, and began, around this time, and then he met in the Dáil, and he gave a speech there in Dublin. And he asked the Irish Parliament, how did you get the British out? I mean, he was doing it peacefully, and the Irish, as you know, there was a lot of bloodshed, but essentially, Ireland was the first colonized country to actually ask the British to leave. And so he was trying to do it politely, and eventually, as you know, it did happen. And then he was assassinated in 1948. And I remember it very well. I remember coming down in the morning, that morning, getting ready for school, and my father telling us that Gandhi had been assassinated. And again, this is interesting that the colors, while they're not exactly the same, and I don't believe this is intentional, I just think it's interesting that they ended up being similar to the Irish flag. And this, of course, is the symbol of the spinning wheel, which was his work bringing back the cottage industry to his people. And this is a little bit of folklore, which I could spend the whole talk on, but I'm just concerned about getting through the program as best I can. So the Tuatha Dé Danann, obviously, here, and this would be this to me as a child would have been like just magic, going into a place like that, and climbing up and hoping to see some fairies, or you never know who you're going to meet on that little path. So there's a lot of folklore around this. This is a beautiful sculpture, and just to touch on this briefly, the hazelnut and the salmon of knowledge, which is again a great Irish legend, is the original story. was told that the child is learning to fish with the master fisherman, probably along the Boyne Valley. And he's warned. The old man goes off to get firewood, and he warns the boy not to, if he catches this one fish you should not catch, and that's the salmon of knowledge, the great salmon of knowledge. And of course, the child does catch the fish, and when the old man comes back, it's already on the spit and cooking on the fire, and the boy has already tasted it. So it's kind of the Garden, and so now he's got knowledge, and this is kind of the Garden of Eden story. But the hazelnut tree is very often over. Remember I showed you earlier those wells, the sacred wells? It had to have a hazelnut tree over it. Well, the salmon would swim up the river, eat the hazelnut, and that's another story of how the salmon gained knowledge itself through eating the hazelnut. And then this is a beautiful sculpture done by a woman. Unfortunately, I don't have her name up here, but this is down in County Wicklow, probably close to Glendalough, sitting in a lake. And it's the salmon of knowledge. Now, I think I told Michael Connolly this story one time, and you'd never heard about the legend of the lone tree. So the lone tree is a sacred tree in Ireland, and maybe in other parts of the world, but certainly in Ireland. So very often in summertime, you'll see the cattle will gather around here, and just for shade, you know. But it's also the tree of the fairies. It's the tree of the little people. This is where everything underground here happens, out of human sight. And so legend has it that if you cut down a lone tree to build a house, you will never have any luck, and they will follow you. So I just have that. It's called the Pulafuka. And the first hydroelectric dam on the headwaters of the Liffey River in County Wicklow, I remember when that was opened. I can't remember the year now, 1940. Well, I don't remember, I was way too young, but I remember going there, I guess. But again, because they had to disturb trees in that area, and it was known as the Pulafuka Valley, they decided that the best way to calm down the little people and not have anybody coming after them to destroy the dam, they called it Pulafuka. And again, community theater. And I was asking Becky earlier, do you have community theater here, or is that something that's in the plan or in the works? Good Irish theater, a little bit of theater, okay. So obviously, these are some of the great recognizable names here of Irish theater. There's Lady Gregory, W.B. Yeats, George Bernard Shaw, and Coole Park, which is still there now. It's a beautiful center. It's usually on my trip, if we can take the time to get over there, it's in County Galway. And this would have been, and this is the famous autograph tree. So all of these great writers would come and stay there and spend holidays, and then they would walk the land, and this became the autograph tree. And so you can see all the names here of all the famous writers who put their symbols on there. And of course, it did get vandalized. So within the last 25 years, they put a circle of wrought iron around it. And then this is the original Abbey Theatre in Dublin. And of course, now it's a theatre, oh my goodness, it's probably 4 times the size of this auditorium, I'm guessing. This is a community theater that my parents were involved with way before I was even a twinkle in my father's eye. There's my mother. This is Frank Carney, Irish playwright, who did a very famous play called The Righteous Are Bold. It's a powerful play, and it was on Broadway. And then some of these other people, I used to know their names when I was a child looking at that picture. And again, you know, people ask me, they say, well, Ireland is a matriarchal country. How can it be a matriarchal country? Well, if it hadn't been for the matriarchs, a lot of Ireland would not have survived, because they were really the keepers of the hearth. I think in a lot of cultures that's true. But Irish women are pretty powerful when they wake up. And again, the reason I put this in is because a lot of times I do see, especially when I came to the United States way back, that most of the Irish writers they have all the greats up there, Yeats and Shaw and all those great people, and Oscar Wilde. But quite honestly, we have some amazing Irish women writers as well. 5 minutes? Okay. And so this is a reading list, and I did, well, if I were giving out a packet today, you'd have all of this in your packet, and this is a recent anthology that just came out. I just gave this to my older daughter for her birthday. So you can see that there's no shortage of chat and words and writing with the Irish, male or female. And so, that's it. Thank you. So, questions? Yes?
Not a question, but just a comment.
Yes.
I was really pleased to learn that you're from County Monaghan.
Oh, really?
Because my ancestors came to this country in 1850 from County Monaghan.
Really?
And settled in southwestern Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Farm. And as when we went back and visited Monaghan, it just really struck me. As I looked around at the farmland, and just the general terrain, I could have been back in southwestern Wisconsin.
Really?
And it just struck me also that when my ancestors left, of course they knew, like most people leaving, they would never go home again.
Right.
But they must have felt. I can see why this whole big community settled from County Monaghan in southwestern Wisconsin.
That's interesting.
Because it must have seemed very much, as much like home as possible.
Right.
There's a little country cemetery there in Wisconsin, near the farm where I grew up. And so many of the people who are buried there are from County Monaghan.
That's interesting. What was the name of the town in Monaghan?
The little parish in Monaghan, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but it's something like Ahabog. And we visited the church.
Ahabog.
Yes, we visited the church and we were there.
Yeah. Yeah, because my father's mother was, her name would have been Trainer, and they were millers out in Ballinode in County Monaghan. So the Monaghan connection was in my family way before my parents moved there. So, anyone else? Yes, hi.
Yes, I was wondering, how do the people of Ireland differ from the people of New England as far as personality, demeanor, friendliness?
That's a great question. It's a loaded question because I might be inclined to say to you, well, the reason the people in New England are so nice and friendly is because of the Irish settling here. I think people are people. I think it's a great question, and it's something to ponder on, isn't it? Because we do find that certain cultures can be more reserved, and that's fine. Whatever works for people. But certainly in Ireland, and I find this myself when I go back, that the whole thing about Irish hospitality, I used to think when I left Ireland, well, yeah, people are friendly over there, they're nice. Obviously, I grew up there, so, but I have to attest to that when I go back, not just because I'm from Ireland, but I witness it when I bring strangers who haven't been there before. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Hi, Susanna.
I was always told that the Black Irish were descendants from when the Spanish Armada was sunk and all the Spaniards swam ashore.
Well, that's one of the stories. But if you put that into the context of 16th century, Elizabethan period, there was a lot of trading going on with the Irish West Coast long before that. Yeah, yeah. Really, yeah. That's very Mediterranean too. Moroccan, Mediterranean, Spanish, Portuguese, any place where they could go fishing too would have been. In fact, I just read something recently. There's a place in Galway called Spanish Point. Maybe you've been there, Michael. And the reason it's called Spanish Point is that during the Armada, some of you are obviously studying European history and history, but during the Elizabethan period, this was the war between Queen Elizabeth I and King Philip of Spain. And Spain, of course, was Catholic, and England was Church of England or Anglican or Protestant. And so these Spanish galleons, they got washed ashore, and there is a place called Spanish Point named for 60 sailors who got washed on shore, had died. They drowned at sea. and they washed ashore. And so they were brought into the community, and no, pardon me, they were alive, and they were brought in, and they were cared for. But when the Irish figured that they were with Queen Elizabeth, with King Philip, and Ireland at that time was ruled by the king, or the queen, they actually executed them. So there is now new archaeology in that area to discover this mass burial ground for these 60 sailors who were washed ashore. And I just love that history we're never done with history. There's always something new to learn and to uncover. Any more questions? My goodness, well.
I bet there'd be some questions in the front row.
In the front row, somebody was asking me about Brehon law. I did put some books up here. So who's in the front? Who's feeling pressure? Yes, go ahead. From the professor.
You were talking about the Brehon law.
Yes.
Do you know what could have caused such an advanced sort of law system to be in place in a culture that wasn't as advanced as the Romans or other medieval cultures?
Well, actually, I think when people come together and they create community, somebody's got to be in charge, essentially, because what we know from history is unless somebody takes a lead, whether it's to provide food or to kind of harness people in and make sure that everybody's helping within a community. If you read about Native American culture, which is very similar, I think, to early Celtic culture, they were dependent on one another. But then the idea of electing somebody to take charge was important. And these laws got written down in a way that they were empowering to the people. One of the laws, which hopefully would be appreciated within this community, is that if a man impregnated a woman and she got pregnant and delivered that child, and he was identified as the father of that child, but was not her husband or not a member of the clan, he was responsible for raising that child and educating that child. I think we should bring that law back. But yeah, a lot of the laws were about land and it was about equality. And there's actually a place in Turkey that was just uncovered, I'm not sure how long ago, but probably Geographic did a whole piece on it. And it was similar, their laws were very similar of gender equality in that particular community. So I don't think it was just germane to Ireland alone. I think that there were communities where they figured out, look, if we're all going to get along, everybody should have some equal rights here. And ironically, here we are today, and we're still hoping to make that happen, right? What are you studying?
Political science and history.
Oh, political science and history. Yeah, one of my sons who dropped out of college in his second year, went back to school in his 40s and graduated with a degree in political science. He's sometimes unbearable to even be with, but however. It scares me to think that he might go to law school, but he would be paying for it for the rest of his life, so I don't think that's going to happen. He's a lovely guy, by the way. Anybody else? Oh, yes, go ahead.
So in ancient Greece, there was a lot of laws based on Homer's texts and things like that. Is there a similar relationship between the ancient Rome and things of that nature with Brehon law?
Yeah, that's why Catherine, when the laws were uncovered, these Brehon laws were uncovered, and I'm not sure exactly how they were written down, but they would have been symbols, I think a lot of symbols, and in the early language, when they figured out how to translate these. See, those laws were in effect from, I don't know how many years before the year 1, Anno Domino 1, but they were still in effect, and they were the laws of the land in community, even up to the Elizabethan period. So somehow when the Elizabethans came in, they didn't like the idea of everybody having equal rights to land and equal, because they obviously wanted all of that land. But somehow they did manage to integrate some of them, and so the laws never went off the books. And just quickly, one of my sisters has a friend who grew up in Ireland in a large family, somewhere in the middle of Ireland, I'm not exactly sure. But there was a lot of land and a lot of property within the family. And she migrated to Canada back in the 50s. And then the parents died, and then there was land being divided up, and she was notified that your dad, I guess, had died, whoever the surviving parent was, and that she would have no rights to the land because she had emigrated, and that it was going to be divided up among the remaining siblings and their spouses. And she said, whoa, wait a minute. And she went to Ireland and she found a Brehon lawyer. And she claimed her piece of land and she got it. So the laws still work. Because in that particular case, I'm not sure who suggested to her. She might not have even known about Brehon laws. But she said, I'm going to Ireland, I'm getting myself a lawyer. And I think when she got there, someone said, you need a Brehon lawyer. And so she got her land. She got her portion of the estate, which she had a right to. Anyone else? Yes, hello.
I was just wondering, especially with the Brehon laws, it was my understanding from books like How the Irish Saved Civilization that, and I don't know if it's part of English propaganda perhaps, but I think we've gotten used to considering Ireland sort of the last outpost of Europe, even just geographically, and thinking, well, therefore, they must be a little bit behind everywhere else. But on the other hand, that wound up being sort of their saving grace because, especially as recounted in that book, when Western Europe, at least as I understand it, when Western Europe was going through the Dark Ages after the fall of Rome, it was Ireland that was actually the most advanced civilization in Western Europe, as I understand it.
Right.
And that the Brehon laws would sort of be like unfolding out of that. And I don't know if I have that correct or.
You know, I to be honest with you, I've not actually made that connection, but it's certainly something that I'm going to look up right now when at some point, but because it's a great conversation. I would say also that if you go back to the monastic settlements in Ireland, you're looking at 5th, 6th century, and then the monks would have been sent there, and a lot of them, I don't know if you've had a chance to even read about the ancient texts, the Book of Kells, the Gospels, the early, all of that beautiful, we would call it artwork today, but it's extraordinary. I mean, one monk, say, going in at the age of 18 or 19, might have only lived for 10 or 15 years, but in that period of time, might have only done 3 pages. I mean, we know how intricate the work was. And there's a lot of interesting side stories about that period in history, but it was the scribes, I think, that sustained a certain aspect of the culture, which of course would have been Christian at that time. I mean, if you look at Patrick, 432, we were always told 432. I'm not sure that it might not have been either a little bit earlier or a little bit later. Laws and history gets rewritten all the time. So we're always pulling another layer back. And that's what I love about Ireland, is that I learn something every time I go to explore it. I'm trying to post on my personal Facebook each day a different picture of Ireland. So one of the first things I do after my walk and I have my coffee is I sit at my desk and I research something that I have not learned myself before, and I post an image or something. Like yesterday, I posted the image, which is contemporary, the young woman who won the silver medal sailing for Ireland, and I posted that on my Facebook. She's 26 years old, and it's the first Olympic medal won in Ireland for sailing in Ireland in over 30 years. So that takes dedication, especially off the coast of Ireland, to sail. It's pretty wild. Anybody else? All right, yes.
Dealing with the theme of Brehon law, do you think that immigrating Irish during the years in the United States could influence laws?
Probably, yes. I think the original intention was equality. I think we had some slippage there. We still do. So, but that's a good question. And I'm listening to you now with your fascination with Brehon law. You need to get this book, or you need to have it in your library. Professor, is that possible? Okay. A copy of, And if you want to get in touch with Catherine Duggan, I can make that happen for you, okay? I'll leave my card. I'm going to leave some cards here for you.
Would you have a minute or so if people would like to come down?
Absolutely. Come down, and I've got some maps if people would like a map. I didn't bring a lot of things with me, but I brought some things today.
We all thank Anne for her.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. As you can see, I love talking about Ireland.